being here. That was pretty cool. I hadn't watched that in a little while, but I loved seeing it. I might just say, are there any questions and not speak, but I know you're not here for that. So thank you all for coming here. I want to just tell you about what we've been doing for a little while. This week on Monday, we started this tour, and we were in Templeton, Iowa, a town of just over 300 people. 80 people showed up to that event, and it was standing room only in Templeton, Iowa. The next day, we went to Sioux City, and we had over 100 people show up to our town hall there. And then yesterday in Atkins, Iowa, over 90 people showed up. And tonight, it's clearly over 100, and I just want to tell you all, this is what a movement looks like to win in November. Really quickly, since we're in Des Moines, I just want to point out a couple people. Our field director, Elijah Bloom, is here. He's going to be running the office here in Des Moines. Elijah. Carter's here. Carter has the privilege of having to drive around everywhere with me, but Carter, we're thankful for all you do. And then Paul, our campaign manager, has been working tirelessly to put these things together so we can have events like this with all of you here. So thank you, Paul, for everything you do. And Geraldine runs the schedule, so if you need something scheduled, talk to Geraldine in the back. Thank you for all you're doing for the campaign, Geraldine. And of course, everyone knows Kelly. We've already said thank you to her, but Kelly, we love. As I was getting into this race, I'm often asked what was the catalyst for this. It wasn't on my bingo card, as I'd say, to run for office. It wasn't something I was looking to do. I actually was looking at the things I'd hear from my neighbors, my family, my friends about what was going on in our state. And I often talk about the 4 systemic issues. I mentioned them briefly in that video. But they're issues that are so vitally important to our state that every time I bring them up, I find that we're finding more and more people who are just saying, thank you for talking about something this serious. The 4 issues we're running on, because we're going to talk a little bit about getting deeper into this Defend Our Land theme. But the 4 issues we're running on are keeping Iowa's kids in Iowa. We are currently 4th highest in the country for net out-migration of our kids. And as I've said, this campaign is about rebuilding culture. It's about the heritage of our state. You cannot rebuild a culture if your people are leaving. That has to be the _1 metric we're tracking. Number 2, we've lost 10,000 family farms over the past 20 years, and the suicide rate amongst our farmers in that time has went up 50%, and nobody's talking about it. It's a generational crisis we're reaching. The 3rd issue, we were once #1 in the nation for education. We're now in the bottom half. I spent the better part of a decade building schools. Matter of fact, when Elon Musk had a school at SpaceX on the campus of Hawthorne, he had one partner school. It was ours, because we had worked so hard to find out what innovation in education really looked like. And the 4th issue we're running on is that we have the fastest rate of new cancer of anywhere in the history of the world. It's something that affects every person in this room. I know that because I drastically underestimated how many people would come to me after I launched this campaign and started talking about these deep issues and say, thank you for talking about this. I've dealt with it myself. I've lost a family member to it. I have a family member that has it right now. This is a crisis of a generation, and we have to confront it head on. When I tell the story about our family farm, my family came here in 1850. My great-great-great-grandfather fought in the Civil War. He's one of the Hawkeyes on horseback. John Wayne actually made a movie, The Pony Soldiers. Many of you have probably seen that. There's actually a great book written about it. That was their company that he's writing about. My great-great-grandfather came over from Germany on a boat at 14 by himself in the stowage. And he made his way to Belin. And he built the farm that remained in our family from 1900 until 2005. And that farm was sold when my great-grandmother passed away. And a number of years later, I was driving by to see the old farm, and I stopped in. I talked to people who owned it. I said, if you ever think about selling it, please let me know. I'd like a chance. And in 2014, they called me, and they said, we're going to sell. Would you like to buy? And before I could even take a breath, I said, yes, 100%. And over the past 11 years, my wife and I have spent rebuilding that farm board by board, literally painstakingly looking at every detail. And people often ask me, why did you do that? I told them I did that truly, because I wanted my children and my grandchildren to understand their story, the story of where they came from. And I guarantee you this, I could walk through this room and talk to just about every one of you and go back 1 or 2 generations, and we would have a shared story. It's a story of the Iowa pioneers, the courageous people who came over and built a state for us and passed something on to us. Theodore Roosevelt's one of my very favorite presidents. And when he was running for president and elected, he said, I intend to be a preaching president. And he was. He was somebody who told us the value of being an American. He gave us talks like The Man in the Arena, where he talked about it's not the critic that counts. And by the way, I've had to learn this because it turns out that not everybody on Facebook that's a friend is actually a friend. It's not the critic that counts. It's the people who will put their hat in the ring. Even though they know they likely could lose, they could be beaten, they could be bloodied, but they're going to do it anyways because there's a cause at hand that we need to be engaged in. So when I thought about this, my wife and I have 7 children, and we try our hardest to help them to build a love of reading. And so when we go into Cedar Rapids, we often go up to Collins Road, and we end up at the thrift bookstore. When you have 7 kids and you're promising them a book, it's one of the only places you can afford a book for 7 kids regularly. But I walk in that door, I go immediately to the left to the Iowa history section. And I love this place because it's a place you can find books you wouldn't find anywhere else. And I will buy books about the heroes of Iowa's past. And I'll go home and I'll find stories in there to share with my children because I want them to know they share the same DNA that you have. You are capable of these same things. And as I've read these stories, some of them have popped out. When we're talking about this idea of defending our land, I often tell people this isn't a new thing. This isn't a new issue. Before Iowa was even a state, Iowa became a state in 1846. Before it was even a state, when it was just a frontier for pioneers coming over to build a life for themselves, to carve it out of a prairie that had been built for thousands of years, they were coming over under a precedent that settlers had. That they could stake a claim to a piece of ground, they could pull the rocks, cut the trees, plow the soil, plant the crops, build a house, and they could claim that property as their own. But at that same time, if you read the history books, which we've forgotten so many of these things, these stories must get back into our classrooms so our kids can understand where they came from. You read the story of what was happening. Speculators out east were buying up the deeds to these pieces of property and coming out here with lawyers and tying our ancestors and these settlers up in court. And when they would do that, these settlers had no money. They couldn't defend themselves. And these speculators would end up taking the improved ground out from underneath their feet. It happened time and time again. And so who rose up then? I call these people some of Iowa's early crusaders. People like James Harlan, a famous senator from Iowa, or George Wallace Jones. These people who became lawyers and then used their efforts to defend the settlers against the speculators. They would put their time and their money and their work directly into making life better for the people that were coming here. And then James Harlan became a U.S. Senator. He actually architected the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act is what made Iowa what it is that we see today. I say this because I'm about to talk about an issue we have in land in our state. And that is that there's been a tremendous amount of extraction happening in Iowa. I was on one podcast with a great group of guys, and after I described it, he said, it's like Iowa's been an open pit mine. It's just being taken from. And I'll tell you, that's not an accident. This is an age-old battle that we've been in. But here's the difference. Back then we had politicians rising up who were there to defend the people against the special interests and the giant corporations and the lobbyists instead of being on their side. And so as I talk about many of the issues I'm going to talk about tonight, you have to understand that we are taking our eye off the ball. When I talk about putting Iowa first, many people ask me, well, Zach, the Republicans have had control of the House and the Senate. They've had control of the governorship. And I say, you don't understand. This is a battle against a uniparty. against special interests that have made their way into both parties to do their bidding at the detriment of our people. So what does it look like? Number one of the biggest issues I hear on the campaign trail right now is about the use of eminent domain for a private company to take land from century farms in the state of Iowa. You know, I am adamantly opposed to any use of eminent domain for private gain, period. But it goes deeper than that. And here's why. The state constitution of Iowa protects from eminent domain for private gain. The Republican Party platform of Iowa protects from eminent domain for private gain. A majority of the House and a majority of the Senate say no to eminent domain for private gain. So what's happened? We have had undue influence in our boards and commissions that are doing the bidding of a company at the detriment of our people. And when I am governor, even if I have to overturn the board and put freedom-fighting private property advocates in there, I will do it to protect the people of Iowa. I was at a debate that was in Des Moines, the Moms for Liberty debate. It's a really great event. You guys did great. Moms for There must be some here. Jen's here, I know. And I remember one of the questions I was asked was, Zach, you've never held office, you never ran for office, how do we know we can trust you? I'm like, well, that's probably how you know you can trust me first. But the real answer to that is, it's how we live our lives. You know, I've gotten one of those pieces of letters in the mail that says they're about to take some ground from you. I got one on the farm that I just told you about restoring. It was about a year after I finished restoring the farm, and I had this place that I had spent all this time putting together. And I got a letter in the mail. I felt defeated after I got it. Because I thought, this is a giant corporation. They have the ability to do this. But I decided I was going to fight. So I called an email. I didn't get any responses. I'm finding out that's a trend. Everybody I talk to that's getting these letters, they find out we actually can't contact these companies. So I decided I was going to go further. I went down to where their headquarters was. And when I went down there, it was the middle of the day, the door was locked, lights were on, and nobody was coming to the door. So I stood outside on the side of the wall and waited for somebody to leave, and I walked in. Because they were wanting to take my land. And I met the person who sent the letter. I was very Iowa nice. I just want you guys to know that. I was very cordial. Because I had to use the element of surprise to some extent. That's kind of why. And I laid this map out on the table as I was talking to him. I said, here's my farmhouse. Here's where, Grandpa and my dad have been hunting pheasants for forever. And right here is where you want to build your giant power line. 150 yards out of my front door. He said, I can't talk to you about this. You have to come to the public meeting. So I went to the public meeting, and after the CEO got done speaking, he beelined it to me, and he said, I heard we might have a problem. And I said, here's the deal. And again, I was very Iowa nice. I said, I am going to fight this, and you're going to beat me. But there's precedent for me to drag this out by 7 years, and I will spend the money to do it every day in that period, because this is the land that my family came and homesteaded, and I have to fight to defend it. 2 weeks later, I received a phone call. We found a new route for our power line. I say that to say this. The governor, the legislature makes laws. I know the governor has influence over, what our priorities need to be. The governor has to be the advocate for the culture. The governor has to be the one that's willing to go and show up and say, I hear that you're doing something that is going to be at the detriment of my people. Explain it to me. Because I'm the last line of defense for the people. That's what the governor has to do. And that's what I've done in my own life. And I will do that for the people of Iowa. We can't talk about land without talking about farming. When I announced this campaign on the front steps of the farm, some of you were there, by the way, thank you for coming. I brought up an issue that I hear farmers talking about all the time. And my entire life, I have heard every politician say that we have to support farmers, we have to support farmers. In my entire life, everything has gotten worse for our farmers. I can't point at one thing except for a temporary bump in the cattle markets that's gotten better for our producers over the long term. I was just talking to a farmer in Dallas County about this exact issue. And after I went through it, the heads were just nodding. And one thing I saw was almost a sadness in the eye. And almost a, what are we gonna do? Because they see it. I was in Sioux City. I saw a kid, a grown man now, that I went to middle school with, 5th generation farmer. And he said to me, I just filed bankruptcy yesterday. The night before, a 4th generation farmer came to me in Templeton, Iowa, with tears in his eyes, and he said, this is the very first year in 4 generations that we are not going to be farming our own ground. I can't even have my kid take over what I did. It's done. I think we drastically underestimate what's happening in our agricultural sector right now. And it goes back to extraction. Right now, the University of Illinois did a study that if you grow an acre of corn in Iowa or Illinois and you grow an acre of corn in Brazil, there's 3 big companies that control 85% of the market. The same 3 big companies in Iowa are the companies in Brazil. And this study showed that they are charging Brazilian farmers $150 less per acre for the same application rate of product. And I just heard it was even worse today, that they're almost giving the product away to help develop this land down in Brazil. Well, American companies are down there developing the ethanol industry alongside them to compete with our industry. There's a tremendous cliff coming for conventional agriculture. And that is that Brazil is bringing on 25 million acres of new ground over the next 24 years to compete in corn and soybeans to create ethanol primarily. And this farmer I talked to today, which is a pretty big farmer, was the very first person I have ever talked to that knew exactly what I was talking about. And he said this, he had a friend that just went down to Brazil and saw this, and he said these words, they are going to crush us. This is about extraction. When I was growing up in Iowa, my great-grandfather was a Funk seed dealer. I still have some of the signs. I have a lot of pictures of him by the signs too. The Funk seed job is what allowed my grandpa actually to earn the $700 that he needed to earn to buy the 1942 Taylorcraft to learn how to fly on the farm and actually physically get off the farm. That was the first generation off the farm. That was Funk seed dealers. When I was growing up in the 80s, there were 300 to 400 different seed input fertilizer companies doing business in Iowa and around the Midwest. Today, 3 companies control 85% of that market. On the front steps of my farmhouse, when I announced this campaign, I made one thing clear. As governor, I am going to lead the charge to bring antitrust suits against these companies and break them apart like Theodore Roosevelt broke apart Standard Oil and JP Morgan to bring competition back to our farmers so they can keep more money in their pockets and they can pass on this legacy to their kids and grandkids. But I'll take it one step further than that. This is not just an issue in Iowa. This is an issue about hollowing out an entire region. And it's happening. We need to get the governors and the attorney generals in Nebraska and Kansas and Missouri and Texas on board. And I'll tell you, their people are on board. This is reaching a fever pitch. People know what's going on. They understand they're being extorted. And they know it's time that we did something. And I have said, I will put every bit of pressure on the leaders of those states as governor to jump on and join. Even if I have to go hold my own town hall meetings with their farmers, we'll do it because it's the right thing to do. We have to start doing the right thing even if it's the difficult thing. And in agriculture, this is one of the biggest. But I'm going to bring up another issue that I think affects not just urban or not just rural, but urban as well. Right now in Iowa, at least 25% of the land in Iowa is owned by people who don't live here. Out-of-state investors and funds are treating Iowa's land like an asset class, keeping our young farmers off of land and preventing them from engaging in this future legacy for their family. But it goes deeper than that. People in these settings very often say, Zach, how much land is owned by the state of China in Iowa? And I say, the political answer to that question is 0 because it's illegal. The real answer is we have no idea because we do not require human-level disclosure of who owns our land. We actually have no idea who owns our land. If your land is owned in an LLC, that's all the government knows. If that LLC has a trust owning it, and they have no idea who the beneficiaries of that trust are. So we don't know. But as governor, I am going to mandate, either by regulation or legislation, that at least the state knows exactly who owns every acre of ground in the state of Iowa, period. This issue affects all of us, and here's why I'll say that. If I ask for a show of hands, which I'm not going to do it, I guarantee you many of you have spent time fighting against solar farms, fighting against windmills, fighting against data centers. Do you want to know who the first people to sign up to say yes to a project like that are? The absentee landowners who don't participate in our communities. I was in Sioux City yesterday, 2 days ago, can't remember now, and one of the county commissioners stood up and he said that to me. He said, I looked at every project, whether it's solar or a data center or wind. He said, I couldn't find one that didn't first originate on the land of an absentee owner. Stewardship is directly connected with your presence on the ground, with your attachment to being on the ground. If you're not connected to the ground, if you're not here, you're not considering what it's doing to the communities. You've probably all heard me talk about this Amish quote that they use before they make a big decision. And that's, what will this change do to our community? Well, if you have no attachment to it, you don't care. This affects all of us. And so I have advocated for creating a new category of property, investment farmland. We would have exemptions for those Iowans that are farming family land. But it would raise property taxes on out-of-state investors and funds that aren't shopping on our main streets, that aren't going to our Friday night football games, that aren't participating in our communities. It would raise their property taxes, and we'd use every dollar of those funds to lower property taxes for the people of Iowa. This isn't a new idea. Ron DeSantis has talked about doing this in Florida. The governor of Montana has done this. He raised property taxes on second homes by 70% because of what I call the Yellowstone effect. Montana is becoming a playground for the rich and the elite. And he used those added funds to lower property taxes for his primary residents by 30%. That's being smart. It's using the art of the deal, as Donald Trump would say, to your advantage. The governor of Iowa has to be the advocate to say, how are we going to use what these companies that want to come in here, for instance, I'll talk about a second about data centers, to our advantage. These projects need to add value to the people of Iowa. We're not against development. We are wanting to go deep and build our culture and our traditions and keep them in our state because there's a large extraction that's happening. The data center south of Cedar Rapids, if you go out there, it's 1,400 acres of land. It looks like a military installation's going in. I've never seen anything built so fast in my life. It's unbelievable. It has to be every piece of heavy equipment in a couple state radiuses out there right now. Google and QTS are putting in a data center park. QTS alone received $529 million in tax breaks paid for by Iowans to come in here. And they're only contractually obligated to create 30 jobs. 30. Donald Trump would say we're suckers. I have publicly said, if you want to build a data center in Iowa, you better plan on paying 5 times the property tax to come to my state. Yeah. And here's why. Property taxes are actually the only net benefit long-term we gain from a project like that. They're not employing our people, not in any large scale. The same footprint of manufacturing would employ hundreds of Iowans. They are not doing it. And so the benefit we get is the property tax. And we should use those funds, if we're going to say yes to a project like this, again, to lower the property taxes in the community around there. The article I read in the Cedar Rapids Gazette about this, and I'll stop with that, was this. Somebody was quoted and they said, well, these people are knocking on our door. Are we just going to say no and have them go elsewhere? Yes, we are, unless they're ready to make our communities better. The final piece I just want to mention here, this is a bit more controversial for me to say about this whole defending our land, but it needs to be said, is going back to the piece about who owns our land. I think it's time that we think of this in a more drastic fashion. You know, when people ask about China owning our land, you know, I talk to farmers who are completely convinced that they know where pieces of land that are owned by China are. But what they don't know is the only way for us to figure that out is if the Attorney General investigates each piece individually of our 24 million acres of ground. We're going to require the human level disclosure. And if we find that Chinese nationals or the government of China is owning farmland in our state, I'm going to confiscate that land. And we're going to help young veterans and farmers start homesteads. Because it's part of that. Somebody once said, how are you going to do it? And I said, well, you know, often Trump talks about this, and he just says, I'm just going to do it. And you know, boy, I won't go any further than that, but it's the right thing to do. They've had plenty of time to divest. It's time for us to take back what's ours. You know, I'm going to end this and then go into Q&A by just talking again about that story I led off with, about the early Iowa Crusaders. These are not drastic things I'm talking about. They're not radical things I'm talking about. You know, the founders wrote the Constitution and went back to their states, and they helped write their state constitutions and helped lead their state governments. They did exactly what I'm talking about. What I mean by that is this. They put in place practices to promote their citizens above the interests of anybody else. They put in place practices to promote virtue and restrict vice, because America and Iowa is not an economic zone. It's a home. It's a culture. That's what it is first. And the free market is something that we use to promote that. That's why that Amish quote makes so much sense. Is because this idea of market fundamentalism and globalism is a lie. If you want to know what I'm talking about, look at what free trade did to an entire portion of the United States population. We were sold a lie that we would get high-tech jobs. There's two groups that got rich from all of that. One, multinational, especially publicly traded corporations. And two, pharmaceutical companies who preyed on purposeless people who had lost their job and got them addicted to opioids, of which many lost their lives. It was wrong. It came from this idea of not asking the question of what will this change do to our community? My promise to you as governor is that the lens that I'm going to look through any decision that we make is very simple. Is this going to make life better long term for the people of my state, or is it going to serve the interests of a lobbyist, a special interest group, or something else? And my promises to you is that I will take the stand to defend the people of Iowa and be on your side every step of the way if you give me the privilege of being your next governor. Thank you all for coming tonight. I appreciate it.
Thank you everyone for coming. If you have a question for Zach, raise your hand. We've got about 30 minutes or 25 minutes for questions.
That should give me time for one or two.
First, thank you. I appreciate you wanting to fight for our kids' education. That is so important. I was a teacher, and I left the profession to actually teach my kids because I saw so many flaws in the system, and I love that you're wanting to do that. Thank you. But I also want to know how you protect homeschool families during that time as well. Please fight for education. We definitely need it, and I love that. But how would you protect them? homeschool family as well?
I think, first, the government has no business being involved in homeschool whatsoever. That's just period. They don't. And as governor, I will be fighting to make sure that doesn't happen. I know very often we talk about these different pieces of legislation. Many of the homeschool families that I know, and I have many cousins that have been homeschooled, and many family members have been homeschooled. And very often, when I see a piece of legislation that kind of sounds good, what they're always saying is there's always a string attached. And so, as governor, I will not sign any piece of legislation that puts any more restrictions or any more oversight over our homeschoolers. By the way, this is a part of the tradition of our state. James Harlan, the man I just mentioned to you, the U.S. Senator from Iowa that architected the Homestead Act, who became the head of the Secretary of Interior, James Harlan was actually there after Abraham Lincoln was shot. And when he was carried out of the hotel, he was one of the men carrying him. His education started, as the story goes, sitting across a table with a Bible and an almanac. And that's how he learned to read, with his mother teaching him. And as he milked cows, his mom would read to him. That's how his education started. And it went on. And people talk about homeschool or home education. That's just how our state was. So homeschooling is a part of our tradition and heritage. And homeschooling families need to be left with the freedom to do exactly that without intervention from our government. And I will dedicate that directly to you on that. I must look like I'm dry or something. But I just want to mention one other thing about this, because I think this is an important point. And I'm not hearing enough people on my side of the aisle talking about this. I believe that the education savings accounts that the governor passed and fought so hard for are good. I believe they actually need to be expanded to include other schools. Schools like the schools I've started, which are micro schools, don't even qualify for them, even though we're the types of schools that could pop up and start 10 new schools in September of this year to educate kids in a really innovative fashion. School choice is foundational to who we are. Parents deserve to have more say over where the kids go to school and more say over where their tax dollars are spent. That's just foundational. But here's the thing. The governor must be the #1 advocate for public school kids in the state, too. There is a battle being waged in our public schools for the hearts and minds of our kids. We cannot cede that ground. We have to be fully invested in that. Often people will talk to me about indoctrination in our schools. And of course, we know this is happening. We understand it's happening. There's evidence that it's happening. We don't know the extent it's happening. But as governor, there's two things I look at: quality of education and culture. On the culture side, a lever that I can pull is that the Iowa Board of Educational Examiners will be filled with people who understand that it's against the law and regulation to bring personal beliefs like that in the classroom. And if we find that a teacher is indoctrinating kids, that board will be instructed to revoke and suspend the licenses of that teacher. And I just want to say, this is not controversial. It's also not partisan. Our parents are just looking for something they can count on. Sending their kid to a good school to get an education, to learn to think critically, write powerfully, speak beautifully. That's what they want for their kids. They're not looking for somebody to tell them what to believe. And I think that's a part of this that must be understood, that this isn't controversial. It shouldn't be. Amongst the vast majority of voters, this isn't. This is what they expect. Look, I want our public schools to be #1 in the nation again, because that will also make our private schools better. I think right now our private schools are getting off a little easy because the competition isn't that hard. We're bottom half. We need our public schools to be leading the way. As governor, on the quality side, like I said, I maybe visited 70 schools when I was looking to start our first school. Our first school is in Wichita, Kansas. I started it in 2018. And now I've helped lead a network of over 300 schools around the country. And these are some of the most innovative schools you could find. Not every school needs to look like mine. The idea is that we have choice in that. But on the quality side, the governor right now can create innovation zones in the state that will allow superintendents to cut red tape and try new methods. By the way, these methods are not new or experimental. They're happening all over the country and all over the world. They're there. There's teachers. If you talk to our young teachers who get into this for 1, 2, or 3 years, they're ready to go. They want out. Because the culture is not good and they're not allowed to innovate. And that's what we need to allow them to do. And this isn't some esoteric idea. This is very specific on what we can do. You know very well, there's so many models out there that are meeting kids where they're at and helping them to learn better. And also models that just understand something simple like this, that 7-year-old boys shouldn't be in a desk for 6 hours a day. Very common sense. I say boys because girls tend towards order quicker than boys do. Boys are chaotic for longer. They shouldn't be in a desk for that long. And you know what? Here's what happens if they can't be. They're medicated. We have an entire generation of people, ever since my generation, that have been over-medicated. And oftentimes they lose and forget who they even are. It's a very sad thing to see. So when I look at this, it's a very personal thing for me because I truly care about education. I care about Iowa's kids. I want to keep them in the state. I want the young parents who are about to have kids to say, I have to get back home. You know, last night in Atkins, I had this young couple that came up to me and they said, we're your poster children. We went out to find something else, just like I did. I thought there was something else out there that was better for me. And they said, we were in Oklahoma. We thought we were living this life. And then we had a child. And we said, we just want to go home. We just want to be around grandma and grandpa. There are so many Iowa kids that are wanting that. And education is a huge part of this. And so I look at these different changes that we can make. This is not left or right. This is about Iowa's kids. And what's the right thing to do for them? And that's the lens I'm really looking at this as governor, is to defend and protect the kids of Iowa. You have my word. I told you, that was like 20 minutes. We got time for half a question now.
So I think that a lot of politicians, they have very strong rhetoric and they come off as very charming and convincing to people. But I firmly believe that we have a lot of blind people in our day and age that are very much so swayed by strong rhetorical speeches or just very conservative promises and such. But I'm a firm believer in voting for the politician with the best ideas, not the politician with maybe the strongest rhetoric or the one who comes off as the most appealing. I believe you have both of that, but yeah. But
turn out into criticizing. Wondering where that was going.
Yeah. But because I think that we need obviously a governor with the general best ideas and the most active plans. And if we don't, we obviously won't flourish or anything. But again, a lot of people are blinded by impressive oratory, and people can't see that a candidate's vocabulary is completely irrelevant to their potential success as a governor. And so my question is what your plan is to get those in Gen Z, so the young conservatives who maybe are naive or more prone to endorsing a non-genuine Republican or a rhino or something. What would be your plan to help get Gen Z, to get them engaged in supporting your ideas rather than people get blinded by other, clearly again, rhino politicians or just people that...
Elijah, can you hire her?
Yeah, people who seem appealing, but they're not. What would be maybe your plan to help my generation to kind of open their eyes? And then your advice to me to get people on board with your ideas my own age?
Gosh, I think just what you just said, it's I think you've got a pretty darn good start. You're doing pretty well. But here's what I'll say. I once heard a political consultant say this, and this was true. I heard them with my own ears. They were talking to a candidate, and here's what they said. As a candidate, you need to imagine every single person in this room is walking around with buttons on them. And those buttons are issues that they care about. And your job is to find out what those things are that they care about and push those buttons so they'll like you. And I think what I said was, you have no idea what the people are actually wanting here. And I think this goes especially for Gen Z. they've grown up in a time where every establishment organization has lied to them. Everyone. Starting with the medical establishment. But then they look at all of these things that come up, especially in Washington, D.C., that get swept. I mean, remember the Somali fraud in Minnesota? What happened to it? Who's been prosecuted? You know, when that happened, I actually said this. I didn't tweet it, but I said it. You guys are all familiar with this rather controversial person named Nick Fuentes. I said, if nothing's done about this, his viewership is going to grow because so many people are going to check out. They're just going to say, the whole thing's a lie, the whole thing's broken. And you know what? Here's the thing. I think that there's a lot of credence to that it's broken, it's a lie, that people aren't telling the truth. I think what you have to do is look at this. You know, the thing that a politician will do is touch on the issues that their consultants tell them not to. I could talk to 9 out of 10 consultants about many of the things I told you here today and say, don't say it. But I'm saying it anyways. Because I'm tired of my people getting cancer. I'm tired of our schools being bad. I'm tired of Iowans leaving our state. It's time for truth. That's what it's time for. No matter what the cost. And so when Gen Z is looking at this, one thing I love that they do is ask the hard questions. They'll ask you the very difficult questions that you're not supposed to answer. Look, there's been a number of people that said if you take on big agriculture, they are going to destroy you. I'm doing it anyways because it's the right thing to do for people. But outside of that, I have to say this. You know, I mentioned this at the Polk County dinner, and sometimes these things come to my head. And I don't think I've ever given the exact same speech ever, which is problematic for me because I leave and I'm like, what did I say? But I remember I used to be on the board of this Christian organization. And it was a board that served pastors. So pastors are people who often serve themselves last, if ever. They have tremendously difficult jobs. They're helping everyone before themselves. And so we had this group that I was asked to be the chairman of the board for. It's a great group. And we bring pastors on fly fishing trips, basically all expenses paid. And we served people who serve people. That was the mission of the organization. Because leaders who lead on empty don't lead well, is what we'd say. And I remember talking to them once, and talking to the leader of this organization. And this is going to connect. This is a Trump weave here, so trust me on this one. And he talked about this verse in Matthew. It's in Matthew 5. Is when Jesus was at the fever pitch of his ministry on earth. And he was entering into this home, and there was a woman who had the bleeding issue, been sick for years. And she said, if I could just touch his cloak, I would be healed. And she got close to him, and she touched his cloak. And what did Jesus say? Who touched me? His disciples were like, what do you mean? Everybody's touching you. Like, it was crowded in here. That's not actually in the Bible. I mean, there's a little bit of it is, but I'm opining a little bit. And he said, no, power went from me. And so the question I ask for you, or for the people in your generation, or for everybody in this room, is when somebody's there to look to you, to give them a little bit of hope, is there any power that can go from you to give them hope? So with you, when you're seeing these people, you're going to see your peers checking out. Give them a reason not to. Talk about our campaign. Talk about things that are going on really well. Tell them about what the hope is. Because ultimately the hope is not in any politician or any campaign. Hope's in our faith and in Jesus. But tell them where the hope lies. Don't let them check out. We have to keep in the fight. I don't have to do this. I'm not saying that in any way of pride. I mean, this is not the most fun thing to go out and do. I'm away from my family. I'm away from my kids. As I said, I have to deal with these comments online all the time. I'm doing it because I'm not going to check out. Because if we don't fight, who's going to stand up for the kids? Is in 20 years, the next governor could be the governor of Iowa until I die. Will my kids even be able to recognize the state that I grew up in? I'm not willing to put that to chance. I'm here to fight and show that there's hope. And hopefully, when you leave here, power has gone from me, if there is any. I'm trying to give as much as I can because I truly believe in the state of Iowa. I believe in the people of Iowa. I believe in the promise. I believe in the history. The crusaders like James Harlan who said, we are going to fight you people on behalf of our people. I believe in that. And I'm hoping that you all can believe in that with me because I'm like you. I'm sick of hearing the lies. I'm sick of nothing happening. And I think Washington, D.C. is all but a lost cause. We have to get serious about protecting and defending the state of Iowa, and that's why I'm running for governor.
We've got time for one more question.
I wasn't far off. 3 questions.
How do you expect to handle this cancer problem in Iowa? It's going to be tough, but do you have ideas about that?
Yeah, I do. You know, I think the first thing is getting to the truth and being willing to overturn every stone. Nothing is off limits. You know, when I go into a Casey's gas station and see 2 or 3 collection jars for a kid with cancer, we've far past this idea that something is off limits. There's many things that are clearly contributing to this. If you just look at the evidence, you know, I often talk to people when I'm talking about this idea of big agriculture. Look, big agriculture companies absolutely have lied about the safety of their product. We have the studies, we have their internal communications and emails. Even as far as this, when Monsanto was going through their process in Europe to have their product licensed, have Roundup licensed, a relicense, the EU said no because of something called POEAs, polyoxyethylated toluanides. It's a surfactant that's within glyphosate, within Roundup, that helps it break down the plant surface to enter into the plant. It does the same thing to human skin. It operates on fat cells. It's what makes it so toxic. And they said, we won't allow you to make this product if you use that. So they went off and formulated a new product with a different surfactant in it that is by some measures 20 times less toxic. And that's what they sell there. What we sell here is actually banned in Europe. But then the email went out. We know about these emails because of the millions of pages of Monsanto files that were accidentally released when they forgot to respond to a request from the plaintiffs. And then it triggered the disclosure of all their internal communication, which, by the way, the judge was going to allow to remain private, which that to me is a travesty in of itself. And one of the emails said this, from a Monsanto scientist to the company in the United States. Why would we keep making a harmful product when we know how to make a safer one? And they didn't change a thing. So number 1, no company ever should have immunity from liability, period. And as a free market person, liability is one of the free market's ways to correct the market. If your product is harming somebody, you deserve to have recourse. They're trying to take that away, and they're going to war. The state legislature is pushing it. The Farm Bill has it in it. There's an executive order that does say immunity. I can go deep into that. I'm not going to right now. And then they're petitioning the Supreme Court right now. That's number 1. Let the market do its job. These lawsuits need to continue because people are harmed. My own father got mantle cell lymphoma, a non-Hodgkin's lymphoma directly correlated to his life in the fields. The second thing is this. The state of Iowa needs to be doing independent testing because the EPA has lost its way. It's a completely captured agency. The studies that they're referencing on the safety of the product come from industry. Almost all of them come from industry. And we have no idea which ones are actually letting them see. There's a 1983 study that the EPA references, but Monsanto wouldn't let get out. It talked about how this product is accumulating in bones for the longest. It's unbelievable. We still don't even have the real study. We just know that it was quite damaging if it would have came out. So the state of Iowa needs to do its own testing. But here's the thing. When it comes to cancer, there are many causes. We know this. The government of Iowa has to be dead set on stopping this crisis. When I talk about Iowa First, people often ask me, well, give me some examples of that. We have maybe one of the world's best research hospitals in the state of Iowa, medical hospitals. Every bit of firepower from the University of Iowa should be aimed at the state to solve this cancer crisis. We have to take away this idea that they have global missions. We need a local mission because our people are suffering. The same thing goes to Iowa State University. We have a farming crisis coming. And we have one of the best ag colleges in the world. Maybe I would say the best. They need to be focused on solving this farming crisis for the future generations of Iowa kids so they can get back onto land. But often when I'm asked these questions, whatever it might be, I always try to go to the root cause. And that's what I'm talking about here. But there's also things we can do on the prevention or even the detection side. Right now there's something called the Gallery test. Has anybody ever heard of the Gallery test? I would highly recommend, if there's one thing that you dedicate to spending money on in your personal lives, it'd be to go home and Google the Gallery test. It is a blood test that can early detect about 200 different types of cancer. Very early, before any symptom sets in. My wife and I do it every year. Once a year, we take the Gallery test. I would like to, as governor, negotiate a deal with that company to get the most at-risk people in my state yearly testing so that they know early if they have a cancer and they can get in to get treatment to stop it and live a long, healthy life. I'm going to end with that, but I just want to remind you all, look at some of Iowa's early crusaders. Look at what they did on behalf of the people in opposition to the powers that be. Grill your politicians. Make them promise on the hardest issues on record that they are going to support you. Don't let them off. Don't let them say they won't take a stance on whether or not a company should have immunity from lawsuit or whether a vaccine should be pulled off the market. Don't let them do that. Demand the real answers, and I'm asking you to fight with me for this Iowa First message to put our state and our people ahead of anyone else and to make Iowa first. Thank you very much for coming.